elf is doing is resisting that being silenced by acting out in the only way they can, which is an act of desperation, right? Which is to act out against nihilism, being drowned in by the culture. That's the point that I was trying to bring up. So, yes.
Hi, my question is for Sean. I was interested by your discussion of Cecil the lion kind of transcending out of the animal or into the human. I was wondering if you could discuss Harambe and the way that that has maintained a part of our sort of social discourse recently, a lot longer than Cecil the lion, and also the complications of the fact that there was a human life involved in the Harambe incident rather than just poaching.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I'm kind of baffled by the continuation of the Harambe meme. It caught me off guard. I'm still kind of confused as to why people find it quite as amazing and funny as they do. I don't know. I think Harambe was an attempt to do something similar. And I think you have the issue of race at the core of the debate over Harambe, and people's reaction was pretty aggressively racist towards the family and the kid involved. And maybe that might help kind of even explain its continuation, especially its use. I've seen it used quite heavily on alt-right stuff. Not exclusively, of course, but the alt-right kind of also enjoys the Harambe memes. And so it might be kind of a coding also in there for race. I personally don't know entirely.
Sure.
It's something that's, I'm still...
Right. I was just curious your input, because I feel like it's shifted in a way that the Cecil the lion didn't, into almost like an ironic conversation about animal life.
Yeah, it's turned into a mocking of that, right? But yeah, I don't know.
Sure, I was just curious if you got any input.
I wonder what anyone else does. If anyone does, please.
Thanks.
A question, sorry, I don't remember your name. I just realized in your speech that in English we have two words to refer to the wildness of nature. Wild for a non-human animal and savage for a human. And then I reflected, well, in Spanish we use the same word for humans and for animals, and therefore we kind of don't take in a very valued way the wildness of nature and the wildness of humans. Well, it's already demonized. So I was thinking, have you got any thoughts about where does that separation of words come? And wild, I'm assuming wild in English, or you see in English cultures, where the wild of nature has some value, or depends, well, more value in some animals and some environments, whereas the wildness of humans, savage, is not something accepted. Have any reflection about that?
Yeah, it's actually something I'm still deeply grappling with, but what I would say to that is that the main distinction is that, as Michael Lundblad in Birth of a Jungle, which is the text I was grappling with, he identifies, is that savagery has more to do with ill intent or some kind of delight in torture than it does with animality. There's this myth that the black male rapist myth was perpetuated due to black men's supposed animality, but was actually designated as because of their own savagery. And so we have to grapple with what these different terms mean, like animality and savagery. And it's really complex because they're constantly contradicting each other. But the main distinction, I would say, is that savagery is seen as inherently oppositional to Western modernity, and it's also heavily racialized. So I feel like these terms are almost empty in a way, because savagery actually has nothing to do with actual savage behavior, just like animality has very little to do with animal-like behavior. I mean, because I would definitely say I feel like the colonists were definitely more animalistic or savage than the colonized. And so it becomes really this discursive mechanism of subjecting racialized groups and providing the rationality for that. And the distinction is that savagery is relegated to these untamable, evil, racial others, while animality becomes this this excuse almost to engage in violent behavior. So a lot of lynch mobs, white lynch mobs, they were excused on the basis of their inner animality, because animals were supposedly amoral, and they were able to excuse their behavior by purporting that they just gave into their own inner animality, which is whereas savagery is more so about a deliberate ill intent to inflict violence upon another person. But again, you have to grapple with the fact that these definitions are not actually literal, because they're in constant contradiction. They're more so racial mechanisms. Yeah.
So going off what you were saying right there, which you said the difference between you were speaking of the animals eating other animals and that role, and then so as human beings eating animals or causing violence on animals, would the difference you say just be the consciousness of it?
Could you repeat
it's
again?
like having humanness and consciousness to know that you're doing this and it's not okay, as opposed to an animal, fighting another animal, killing another animal, or however that looks within the earth.
Yeah.
And then the consciousness being okay, well, there's another way.
Yeah. I would say in the 20th century that is definitely kind of how it comes to fruition, is that there's a difference in consciousness. Again, animals are seen as amoral beings who can't control themselves, and we can even see this to this day, how people use animals in order to reify certain differences. So a lot of men will talk about how their behavior towards women is justified because of how they're just embracing their own inner animal or whatever it may be. And so it's relegated to this space of I can't help it. It's just the inner animal acting out of me. And savagery is defined as this ill intent, like you said, this consciousness, this purposeful desire to inflict pain. But again, it really has nothing to do with a desire to inflict pain. I think it has more so to do with deep-rooted white fears and anxieties about rebellion and insurrections from people of color, but most specifically black people. And so savagery was definitely relegated to black people in times when whites feared some form of rebellion or insurrection as a means to put them down. Does that kind of get at what you're asking?
I have a question over here. I'm not really anyone to be asking it, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Is this separation between this creation of race and the separation between human and animal, does that do more to a difference in thought process than it does into any actual physical characteristics? Because if you look at Romans, the term colony is it derives from a Latin root. And when Rome conquered Europe, when the indigenous people of Europe had a different thought process entirely from that of Rome and that of any civilization. So does this go beyond the idea of race? And there are very few indigenous people left in Europe who think the traditional way. We're thinking mainly about the Sami and Scandinavia. So is the desire to create the concept of race based on a radical difference in thought process more than any physical characteristic?
That's a really good question. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's a really great question.
There's probably some utility involved in it, economic exploitation, right? So I think that would have to be obviously one of the factors. Could you exploit this group of people? I mean, you think about the first waves of slavery and stuff.
Because even the term Slav, isn't that from the
Yeah.
Slavic people itself,
Yeah.
who were European in origin?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of times you see, ideas often come out of material changes. So I think race developed at a certain time during a certain political economy moment. Same with expansion of Roman colonization. And I think the kind of concepts of race or difference that get created from these systems of power is tied a lot of the ways to the economy and to the structure of stuff. So, like the one example I would think of, it doesn't have to do with race per se, or even like a concept like that, but ancient Egypt, they had or even ancient Greece, they had the concept of the steam engine. But there was no need to develop a steam technology system because you had a slave system, and so you had an economy that didn't make it need it. So the concept of steam was just a thought, right? But it needed that moment in which you could use it to exploit the world. If that makes sense, that we really take that idea and use it. I think race might be similar, like it comes at a certain time due to what was political and economic reality. But yeah, I don't think it has to do with anything innate.
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are definitely the two central features of race, and I think it's that the way that it kind of functions is that physical difference, like you point out, has implications for the thought process of that person. So, it's a really tough question about which one came first, but again, like if you look at the origins of how these ideas of race came to fruition, I mean, jumping off of Professor Carson's work, that these ideas of race were heavily shaped by capitalism, by material regimes, not necessarily reductive to it, but you see the ways in which race is it's not very monolithic, it's extremely different. So let's say in the Americas, indigenous people were racialized as the other who was constantly disappearing. So in a lot of decolonial thought, they call this like the logic of elimination, whereas the African was racialized as the only inherently enslavable population, at least around the 16th century, because indigenous people were still being enslaved up to that point. And so yeah, it's an amalgamation of all three, like the material regimes, the thought processes, and like the physical differences. They all kind of like work together. I have a question, actually.
No, go ahead.
Jumping off your conclusion, because that's something that I'm trying to grapple with a lot, is that seeking both animal rights discourse as well as a lot of decolonial Black studies discourse kind of seeks to move beyond the human, except the problem with that is with post-humanist studies and animal rights discourse, even like a lot of critical animal studies, is that they presuppose that all humans have been integrated within this category of human. And so it's a lot easier, let's say, for activists to want to move beyond the human or claim that we are all animals when it has such radically different implications for each other. And so there's this like, that's like the central paradox that I've been trying to deal with, like how to both a lot of animal rights activists as well as Black studies and decolonial theorists identify that it is this idea of the human or man which needs to be abolished. But I would say that some populations are more invested in their speciesism or their humanity than others, and like extremely rightfully so.
Yeah.
So it's like extremely
Well,
hard,
that's why
hard issue.
I'm wondering, and I might be wrong here, and this is just something I've been working with. That's why I thought maybe using Afro-pessimism to think of humanity as a concept of whiteness, instead of saying we're all animals, saying we all must oppose whiteness, and not everyone is in the same category defined as white. So then it gives it helps maybe understand or create a space for difference while still a common enemy, in a way. I'm not sure if I don't know if it works.
I don't know if you can answer this in a little bit of time, but coming from Australia, lots of my readings around race and how race or racism works in Australia is quite different. So I'm just wondering, and I don't know if any of you can expand on this. It's hard for me to imagine this 16th kind of century and through blackness when. How does colonisation play into that in terms of Indigenous cultures? I think we were kind of touching on it, but I'm just wondering, like, because it seems, where's that part of the kind of the creation of racism? Say you were talking to someone who doesn't come from this American context, so I don't know that kind of more minute history, because that just seems like to just have that as one of your starting points seems to be missing Indigenous cultures. But maybe you didn't cover that because it's a huge topic to do everything.
Just started to get at some of that.
Just for clarification, are you asking like how indigenous people were racialized or conceptualized in the Americas?
Well, just because your point was kind of that this is where racism was utilised at this point, it is one of the points. But so then, how does kind of indigeneity being used and to oppress indigenous people? Where's the point? Where's that point? You know.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do either of you want to jump on that before?
I'll say something. I think in drawing a distinction between like racism or noticing differences and institutionalizing it has to be done, because that's usually ex post facto. It's after the fact. You start in on this sort of course of action, and then if you look at the history, like in the United States, we started looking for scientific reasons of racism, right? So we had a whole discipline of science that emerged to describe that white men were superior, and it depended on where the studies came from. If it came from England, well, they were the smartest white men in the world, and then it would work its way around, right? So, but I mean, there's a process in which I think, you know, where we notice differences for a long time, and I think the very early encounters, like, I'm thinking with the rationales that were used for example, destroying the Taino and the Hispaniola, which was now Haiti and Dominican Republic, the genocide that Columbus committed when he came over, which I think was largely sort of predicated on a kind of notion of, well, we wanted gold, and you had things we wanted, so we're going to take these things, and then the rationale became to Christianize them, and they didn't talk about them necessarily as being inferior, but it was this idea that they were inferior only in the sense that they weren't Christians at that time, right? And so when we draw this racial line that I think Sean's talking about, we're really talking about the nature and process by which it becomes institutionalized in the fabric of American culture. Because those early encounters with indigenous peoples as colonization was moving out around the world, right? We're really sort of products of encounters with different people, and what could we get from them? Because they originally, I mean, trade was the driving factor there, right? And so we run into these sort of different people, and then we start to take their stuff, and because their way of life was different, then we had to justify reasons for doing it, right? So it's kind of after the fact. I mean, I don't know. That's just, I mean, that's the way it comes through.
I guess because the difference is in Australia, maybe it's coming later, and so it is just race is just used, or indigenous people were
with the Aborigines.
They were just called
sure.
flora. They were put in as flora and fauna. So that actually is the straight up
right.
initial. So that's maybe we're at this point where I'm not understanding.
Yeah.
This is
This,
quite
I think, highlights
different.
the ways in which race is kind of constructed by different histories and contexts. Like, so the white-black dichotomy does not apply nearly as well to all countries, right? Like Australia, for sure. I mean, one thing I think we might also want to try to do is to think about how black-white racism operates differently than settler colonialism. One of my friends who teaches applied indigenous study, or teaches political science and indigenous studies back east, has a piece, and I can't remember the name of it now, but it looks at the Redskins name, and he tries to make a difference between settler colonialism and racism. And make an argument that we need to think of them as operating differently in the U.S. context. But it's really, I think, that's the most important part of the U.S. context. Like, we can't universalize it.
Yeah, you kind of already answered it, but I was just going to say that, I mean, that's one of the critiques of Afropessimism, right? That it's foundational, and indigenous critics have that, there's that back and forth about what's foundational. And I'm still struggling with that myself, but I do find Wilderson's reading of, the Middle Passage as being, a really critical moment. I think there's a lot to grapple with that, and its influence on, its global influence, the global influence of, the Middle Passage.
And as I may add to that, Mark gives a good hint about it. If you think about political institutions that are built around economical institutions, it's different for indigenous, like the aims with what they had with indigenous of what they had with Africans, even in the same territory. Right. So that took different specific ways of discrimination and racism in each.
I think we're done. We're getting a lot of sign over here.